Montana Territory, 1883. While his neighbors were celebrating finished cabins and preparing for their first frontier winter, one Swedish immigrant was being called the biggest fool in the valley. His crime? Building what looked like a wooden fence completely around his perfectly good log cabin, then stuffing the gap with dried grass and river moss. They had names for what he was doing: wasteful, ridiculous, the work of a man who didn't understand how things were done in America. But when the January blizzards arrived with winds that turned cabins into iceboxes, those same neighbors would be knocking on his door, desperate to understand how his family slept in shirt sleeves, while their children shivered under every blanket they owned. This is the story of Anders Lindholm, the double-wall cabin and the winter that proved sometimes the craziest-looking idea is actually the smartest thing you can do. If you love stories about practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We dig deep into history to find the innovations that actually worked. Anders Lindholm stepped off the steamboat in Fort Benton in May of 1883 with his wife Ingrid, 3 children, and a reputation for being overly cautious. Back in Sweden, he'd worked at a commercial ice storage facility in Stockholm, where massive blocks of winter ice were preserved through blazing summer heat, using nothing but sawdust, dead air, and clever engineering. His neighbors back home had thought the whole operation was witchcraft. How could ice survive July? But Anders had seen the physics firsthand. Thick walls filled with sawdust created pockets of trapped, motionless air. That dead air became a barrier that heat couldn't cross. The principle was simple. Moving air steals warmth through convection, but air that can't move can't steal anything. Now, staring at the Montana plains where wind raced unobstructed for 100 miles in every direction, Anders knew exactly what he needed to build. By August, his main cabin was complete. 14 by 20 feet, solid lodgepole pine logs, chinked tight with clay and moss. It looked exactly like every other homestead cabin in the valley. His neighbors, mostly German and Irish families who'd arrived a year earlier, nodded their approval. The Swede might be odd, but at least he could build a proper cabin. Then Anders started building the second wall. He began by setting vertical posts in a perfect rectangle 12 inches outside his log walls, not attached to the cabin itself, but freestanding, creating a complete outer shell around his home. The posts went up quickly, rough-cut cedar that he'd hauled from the mountain slopes, spaced every 3 feet around the entire perimeter. By September, tongues were wagging. The valley's unofficial leader, a German farmer named Klaus Bergman, who'd survived 2 Montana winters already, rode over to see what madness the Swede was attempting. What he found looked like a stockade fence built in the wrong place. Anders had begun nailing horizontal planks to his outer posts, creating a second wooden wall that stood a full foot away from his cabin logs. At ground level, he'd left a small gap covered with wire mesh. At the roofline, he'd cut ventilation slots into the planks. Bergman couldn't make sense of it. The outer wall served no structural purpose. It didn't support the roof. It didn't protect the logs, which were already chinked and sealed. It was just there, taking up lumber that could have been used for a barn or outbuildings or any number of practical purposes. The other valley families agreed. At the September barn dance, the Lindholm cabin became the joke of the evening. Someone started calling it the cabin in a crate, and the name stuck. Others called it Swedish foolishness, the kind of overthinking that happened when educated city folk tried to live on the frontier. Anders heard the talk, but kept working. Through late September and into October, he cut and dried prairie grass, hauling wagon loads to his cabin and spreading it on racks to cure in the autumn sun. He gathered moss from creek banks, picking through it carefully to remove any damp sections that might rot. Everything had to be bone dry before it went into his wall cavity. Then came the filling process. Working section by section, Anders stuffed the 12-inch gap between his walls with loose, fluffy layers of dried grass and moss. Not packed tight, but loose enough that tiny air pockets formed throughout the material. He was recreating the same structure he'd seen in Stockholm's ice houses, where each strand of organic material trapped a bubble of motionless air. The valley women thought he'd lost his mind. Who fills their walls with hay? Mice would nest in it. Birds would peck through and make homes. The whole thing would rot by spring and smell like a compost heap. But Anders had done his calculations. The loose organic fill, kept dry by his ventilation slots, would trap air in thousands of tiny pockets. Wind hitting his outer plank wall would lose its force in that dead air space, never reaching his actual cabin logs. The principle was identical to how ice houses kept winter frozen through summer, just working in reverse. By the time the first snow fell in late October, Anders had completed his double wall system. His cabin now sat inside a complete wooden shell, with 12 inches of hay and moss filling the gap. Small hinged doors in the outer wall lined up with his windows and main door, creating a double barrier entry system. The mockery reached its peak. Klaus Bergman told anyone who'd listen that the Swede had wasted 3 weeks and 300 board feet of good lumber building a fence around a perfectly weatherproof cabin. When Anders tried to explain the concept of dead air insulation, eyes glazed over. This was Frontier, Montana, not a Swedish science lecture. Then November arrived, and with it, the kind of cold that separates survivors from victims. The first serious storm hit on November 8th. Temperatures plunged to 15 below zero, driven by winds that sustained 40 miles per hour for 36 straight hours. It was the kind of cold that found every weakness in every structure, probing gaps and cracks with fingers of frozen air. At the Bergman cabin, Klaus woke before dawn to find ice coating the inside of his walls. His breath had condensed on the frozen logs throughout the night, creating a crystalline layer that made the interior feel like a cave. The water bucket beside his stove had frozen solid despite a banked fire that should have kept it liquid. He rekindled the fire immediately, feeding it split logs, but the heat seemed to vanish as fast as the flames could produce it. The wind was driving cold air through microscopic gaps in his chinking, while simultaneously pulling heated air out through other cracks on the opposite wall. His cabin had become a thermal sieve, bleeding warmth faster than he could generate it. The O'Brien family, 2 miles south, faced the same crisis. Despite burning through their entire daily wood allocation by midnight, their interior temperature never rose above 35 degrees. Their 3 children slept huddled together under every blanket in the house, wearing coats and hats indoors. The wind was the problem, though none of them fully understood why. A blizzard doesn't just lower the temperature outside. It creates pressure that forces cold air through any available gap, while pulling warm air out through others. A single log wall, no matter how carefully chinked, presents hundreds of tiny infiltration points. The logs themselves become thermal bridges conducting exterior cold directly to interior surfaces. At the Lindholm cabin, a different physics problem was being solved. The outer plank wall took the full force of the 40-mile-per-hour wind, creating turbulence in the 12-inch cavity filled with hay and moss. But that wind couldn't push through the dense, fibrous material. Each strand of grass created a barrier. Each clump of moss trapped a pocket of air. The wind's energy dissipated in that sacrificial outer zone, never reaching the actual cabin logs. The Lindholm family woke that same November morning to find their water bucket still liquid. No frost on the interior walls, no visible breath clouds indoors. Anders added a few logs to his banked fire and checked his thermometer readings. Outside the outer wall, 18 below zero, Inside at the log wall surface, 3 above zero. 21 degrees of protection provided by nothing but dead air and dried grass. Word spread fast in a valley where survival depended on shared information. By the third day of the cold snap, Klaus Bergman swallowed his pride and rode to the Lindholm cabin. He found Anders splitting kindling in his shirt sleeves, while snow continued to pile against the outer walls. Bergman's own cabin had required constant fire feeding throughout the night, burning through wood at an unsustainable rate. The Lindholm fire had been banked at midnight and still held enough coals at dawn to restart easily. Anders showed him the smoke test. He lit a match and held it near the outer plank wall. The smoke immediately bent horizontal and disappeared through the gaps between planks. The wind was hitting that outer surface with full force. Then he held another match near the interior log wall. The smoke rose straight up, barely disturbed. The actual cabin sat in nearly still air, protected by 12 inches of hay-filled dead space. The principle became clear through demonstration. The outer wall was sacrificial, taking weather damage and wind force. The inner wall, the actual cabin, stayed in a zone of thermal calm. By the end of November, Anders had begun keeping detailed records. Each morning at 6, he recorded paired temperature readings, outer wall surface and inner wall surface. The difference consistently ranged between 17 and 23 degrees, with the best reading hitting that 21-degree mark. His fuel consumption told an even more dramatic story. To heat his cabin to 55 degrees each evening, Anders burned 4 split logs. Bergman, heating a similar-sized space to the same temperature, burned 7 logs. The difference wasn't in the stove or the wood quality, it was pure heat retention. Bergman's single-wall cabin fought constant infiltration, with cold air streaming in while warm air escaped. His stove worked against a continuous thermal drain. Anders's double wall had eliminated that drain entirely. The December storms brought more families to the Lindholm door, not for shelter this time, but for information. How wide did the gap need to be? What materials worked best? Could they retrofit existing cabins, or would they need to rebuild? Anders shared every detail freely. 12 inches minimum for the cavity, loose organic fill at about 3 pounds per cubic foot, dense enough to stay in place but loose enough to trap maximum air. Ventilation slots at top and bottom to prevent moisture buildup. Wire mesh at the base to keep the fill contained. The blacksmith's wife asked if moss would rot. Anders explained his drying process. Cut in early fall, spread thin on racks, cure for 2 weeks minimum until brittle dry. Kept dry by ventilation, the organic fill would last 3 to 5 years before needing replacement. By January, 2 families had begun emergency retrofits on their existing cabins. They couldn't build full double walls in winter, but they could lash plank screens 8 inches off their windward walls and stuff the gap with loose straw from their barn supplies. The crude version didn't match Anders's full system, but it produced measurable improvement. 10 to 15 degrees of interior temperature gain during high winds. The Valley school teacher, a meticulous woman named Catherine Wells, began documenting the phenomenon for the Territorial Education Office. She took temperature readings at 3 different cabin types: standard single-wall emergency retrofit and Anders's full double-wall system. Her January 15th measurements during a 20 below cold snap showed stark differences. Single-wall cabins, interior temperatures of 5 to 15 degrees before dawn. Emergency retrofits 20 to 30 degrees before dawn. Lindholm double wall, 35 to 40 degrees before dawn. The physics validated across multiple implementations. Dead air worked. Fibrous materials that trapped air worked. Sacrificial outer walls that took wind force worked. Spring brought formal requests for construction specifications. The Territorial Agriculture Office wanted diagrams. New homesteaders filing claims wanted material lists. Even Klaus Bergman, who'd led the mockery, began planning a complete double-wall rebuild for the following summer. Anders provided everything freely, not as vindication, but as practical information that might keep families alive. He sketched cavity dimensions, listed board footage requirements, explained fill material preparation. The method required more initial labor than single-wall construction, but the fuel savings alone justified the investment within a single winter. By 1885, double-wall construction had spread throughout Montana Territory's exposed valleys. Homesteaders adapted the method to local conditions, using sawdust where hay was scarce, increasing cavity width where lumber was abundant, adjusting ventilation based on local humidity levels. The core principle remained constant: moving air steals heat. But dead air trapped in fibrous material creates a barrier that wind cannot penetrate. Modern building science would later validate every aspect of Anders's method. Trapped air remains the fundamental insulating principle in contemporary construction. Fibrous materials still demonstrate effective thermal resistance by preventing air circulation. Wind infiltration still overwhelms inadequate barriers in exposed locations. What the valley had called Swedish foolishness became documented frontier survival technology. The cabin in a crate became the warmest home in Montana Territory, and the man they'd mocked for building a wall around his cabin became the reason their own children survived the winter. Sometimes the craziest-looking solution is just physics that nobody else understands yet. And sometimes a wall around your house isn't a fence at all. It's 12 inches of dead air that keeps your family alive when the thermometer drops and the wind won't stop testing everything you built. That's a principle worth remembering and worth building around.